The rhythmic chopping of helicopter blades over a landscape of lush jungle was the very milieu of the Vietnam War. Yet from 1961 onwards, these helicopters came with more horror than the rattle of artillery, the unloading of soldiers, and the devastating drops of bombs. The American forces had a wicked and costly problem. This was jungle warfare. The Vietnamese knew their jungles as well as a family member, and the Americans only found endless flora to get lost and killed in. With a call to alter generations, the highest military command decided to level the playing field, to level the jungle. For a decade solid, as helicopters filled the skies with their signature chopping hum, millions of gallons of dioxin were dumped all across the Vietnamese countryside. The Americans had been told it was harmless. The Vietnamese likely presumed otherwise. To this very day, the effects of this toxic compound have been felt in birth and health defects across American and Vietnamese generations, and the precious environment has never been the same. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we examine what it was like to witness Agent Orange. The curious and lasting name Agent Orange is something of a misnomer. The chemical itself was not orange. It belonged to a group of different defoliants used across Southeast Asia, euphemistically called the rainbow herbicides, for in the majority, they were named after colors. The herbicides were titled Agent Green, Pink, Purple, Blue, White, and no less than 4 different editions of orange. Yet no, Agent Orange was not orange, but it was identified by the color. The 55-gallon drum cans it was produced in had an orange stripe, and the rest is some pretty dark history. After a long period of denial that any harm could come from exposure to the chemical, the US government finally committed to having its service members' backs. Agent Orange had one primary use in the Vietnam War: destruction. The herbicide chemical was developed by the United States government in the 1940s. Its purpose was to control overgrowth across power lines, railroads, and industrial-scale agriculture. In the Vietnam War, the most outstanding advantage the Communist forces had over the U.S. deployment was their abundant jungle. By 1961, the president of South Vietnam, Lo Dinh Diem, requested the U.S. to start defoliation of the Vietnam jungle to help even the odds. From 1962 to 1971, the United States conducted Operation Ranch Hand, spraying around 19 million U.S. gallons of herbicides and defoliants across South Vietnam. The result was clinical. Over 3 million hectares of forest were decimated, hemorrhaging reforestation chances and radically shrinking the species diversity. Then there were the human costs. The legacy of Agent Orange, despite its staggering environmental costs, was ultimately a human one. Figures differ, even if the results are all unsightly. The Vietnam government would state 4 million people were exposed to the agent, with it leaving 3 million riddled with illness. The Vietnamese Red Cross stated that over 1 million disabilities and health ailments were a result of exposure to Agent Orange. The US government, however, would throw doubt these figures. Yet, the results were there for all to see. The multifaceted health complications found across the Vietnam populace included mental disabilities, extra fingers and toes, genetic diseases, and even high levels of dioxin found in the breast milk of South Vietnamese women. Though the brunt would be borne by the Vietnam population, those same high dioxin levels could be found in the blood of US veterans who served. Quite remarkably, the extent of the damage potential from Agent Orange was kept from the US forces delivering it across the South Asian countryside. Kept oblivious to the afterlife and danger apparent, US soldiers would use the empty 55-gallon drums of Agent Orange and repurpose them for makeshift showers. Compensation of American veterans has been a battle played out across court cases in the decades since. Agent Orange, without a doubt, caused devastation across South Vietnam. But it was far from the only chemical agent used, and neither was Vietnam the only place left affected. Operation Ranch Hand was a wholesale effort to deprive the enemy of cover from vegetation, but also food, with the chilling motto found all over U.S. service posters: "Only you can prevent a forest." Yeah, chemicals were sprayed all across Southeast Asia. While not anywhere near the extent found in Vietnam, both Laos and Cambodia would have defoliants sprayed across their countryside. Cambodia's defoliation was crystallized in the 1969 attack on the Kampong Cham province. Rubber plantations were targeted, resulting in a 12% loss of the country's major international export. Laos defoliation, on the other hand, appears a well-kept secret. A 15-year survey from 2020 observed respondents from 126 Laos villages across 5 separate districts. Birth defects were found at a comparable rate to the most copiously sprayed areas of Vietnam. If there was any upside to be found in the use of herbicidal warfare in Vietnam, is that it soon brought forth the outlawing of it. In 1976, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution against it, and did so in the name of the environment. The EMOD, less easily known as the Convention of the Prohibition of Military or Any Other Hostile Use of Environmental Modification Techniques. Bet you can't say that backward. I can't. Would widely forbid any environmentally harmful chemical usage. Curiously, this came a year after the end of the Vietnam War, and the call for the outlawing came from the U.S. government. The initial narrative of Agent Orange, brought to U.S. servicemen, was a long way from reality. U.S. veterans returning to the United States after Vietnam would find out independently and often in the worst ways. As servicemen in Vietnam, soldiers were informed the herbicide was entirely unharmful to them. However, in the late 70s, with returning veterans just returning to civilian life, the consequences of Agent Orange began to unfold. Numerous veterans were given the horror of watching their health decline for no seeming reason, or witnessing their wives miscarry, or most jarring, their children being born with defects. Just 2 years after the war's end, veterans were filing claims to the Department of Veterans Affairs for healthcare coverage in response to this. The department would deny claims unless their condition had started during service or within a year of their discharge as soldiers. Suffering Vietnam-era veterans would have to wait over a decade before the U.S. government was ready to face the destructive legacy of Agent Orange on its own veterans. While the United States would face many accusations of minimizing and ignoring the effects of Agent Orange, in the early 90s, that would take a change. During the administration of George H.W. Bush, the U.S. government would openly commit to funding the research of victims of the chemical. The Agent Orange Act of 1991 gave the National Academy of Sciences permission to analyze and explore data and research from the chemical exposure of military veterans. Ratification of the act meant blood and tissue samples could be voluntarily given by Vietnam veterans. Furthermore, the studies knew exactly what to look for: conditions correlating to acneiform disease, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, soft tissue sarcoma, and chloracne. When the U.S. government would finally come around to serving its veterans' plight in the early 1990s, their work was cut out for them. 2 years into the Agent Orange Act in 1993, compensation had been provided to 486 victims. The number of claimants, though, was over 39,000 veterans. The effects of Agent Orange are and have been felt ever since. The infamous defoliant was a mushroom cloud, leaving a trail of destruction wherever it was manufactured or used. In 2012, a lawsuit was settled over dioxin contamination surrounding a manufacturing plant in West Virginia. Decades later, just a location manufacturing Agent Orange was openly harmful to its surroundings. Starting the same year, the U.S. government joined the Vietnam government for the first time in an Agent Orange cleanup in Vietnam. Dioxin hotspots including Bien Hoa and Dong Nai have been tackled, with the U.S. funding $41 million to the effort. Specific birth defects in the children of Vietnam veterans have come to be seen as likely resulting from exposure to Agent Orange, namely the incomplete closing of the spine, medically known as spina bifida. Yet perhaps the most damning cost of all is the very purpose of using an herbicide in war. The after effects on crops and the land. The dioxin within Agent Orange does not deteriorate naturally, meaning it is liable to accumulate in the fat of animals from their grazing. Yes, quite tragically, Agent Orange has an afterlife in the food chain thanks to this. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.